Putin interview.
Moreover, even when I became president, I didn't understand everything right away. I began to convey to my Western colleagues, look, you say one thing but do another. Here is the proof. Then I presented this proof. They nodded and said, yes, yes, we will sort it out now. And nothing happened, it was quite the opposite. It became obvious to me that ideology might have had some significance, but essentially, all these contradictions are based on geopolitical interests. That was the main thing. I mean, the Soviet Union performed an auto-da-fe, it liquidated itself. Partly, I think, I never discussed this with my predecessors. They believed that Russia would become part of the so-called civilized world. In the West, they decided the following, there is no Soviet Union, so why should we follow the rules concerning Russia, which does not possess the potential might that the Soviet Union had. Now we will carve out something for ourselves as we like and live by rules we invented for ourselves, ignoring our interests. I will not go into details now because we proposed a lot in the field of strategic offensive arms and in the field of missile defense. Everything was constantly rejected. Well, it became clear that until we assert ourselves as an independent sovereign power capable of defending our future, we will not be respected. In those relatively recent times when we tried to copy everything from the West, many worshipped the USA in 1990s. When you worked in the St. Petersburg City Hall, was it really the case that a senior American delegation flew to St. Petersburg? And one of the Americans either pushed or rudely handled a Russian on the runway, and upon learning about this, you refused to receive this delegation at St. Petersburg City Hall? Did that happen? I don't quite remember that. Honestly speaking, maybe it was... Yes, I probably understand what you're talking about now. There was an episode. Honestly, it was insignificant. This American delegation did come to St. Petersburg, and someone from this delegation was very rude to a border guard. Yes, that's what happened. I was recalling whether it was a customs officer or a border guard. It was a border guard. I considered that absolutely unacceptable because a person in uniform, while performing his duties, represents the state, and treating him with disdain means treating our state with disdain. Of course, we didn't refuse to receive this delegation. We worked with them as planned according to protocol, but I simply didn't interact with them. Is it risky to let them understand, you, friends, are behaving very hypocritically? Well, yes, in some sense it is risky because Russia opposed those trends that were gaining momentum in the world at that time. By the way, I drafted my Munich speech while flying on the plane. While flying, I looked at the draft that my colleagues prepared, put it aside, and rewrote everything from scratch. I did this not because we wanted to confront and argue with someone. No. Russia is a country that cannot live otherwise, and I considered it correct and timely to articulate our concerns. Moreover, you can trust me, I saw that the same concerns arose among many other participants in international relations. But considering the global power of the United States, they kept quiet and held their tongues. But I reiterate, I didn't say it to argue or to confront Russia against someone. We simply cannot live otherwise. Russia will either be independent and sovereign or will not exist at all. I wanted to convey this to our partners in the hope that they would hear and somehow adjust their attitude towards Russia, considering that, for instance, since the 1990s they promised us not to expand NATO to the east. They lied at every step, constantly deceiving and pretending that nothing of the kind happened. The same was true on many other issues. Therefore, it seemed to me that it was about time to tell our colleagues, we need to live peacefully. Let's somehow treat each other with respect, without imposing our will, without attempting to suppress another will, considering the interests of all participants in international communication. I don't know how effective it was, but since it's often remembered, it seems it was timely, that's what I want to say. But unfortunately, it was not heard. We constantly, I want to emphasize, constantly made attempts to establish relations to not lead to the situation we are in today and to develop some common rules. As soon as Ivan IV Ivan the Terrible said, "No, we remain Orthodox," a legend immediately arose that he was cruel, a tyrant, that he was insane, and so on. Although no one recalls in such a context what was done by Oliver Cromwell, what happened in England, in France. The Western history is silent about this. In any case, it does not give such evaluations as that it was barbarism, that civilization is absent. But they tried to subordinate Russia even then. In some former colonial empires, in Great Britain, in France, they consider us guilty for the collapse of their colonial empires. And this historical memory, historical negativity persists. I see it. Strangely enough, it sometimes makes me laugh when I watch it. But I note it in small fragments. I'm not making this up, I see it. But the fact is that after World War II, the United States, along with the Soviet Union, by the way, in some ways worked towards the destruction of these empires and worked to assist the colonies in gaining their independence and sovereignty.
Я в пуле в президентском 20 лет.
I've been in the presidential pool for 20 years. I have watched many of your trips. I remember the times when there were non-stop business trips to European countries and Russia's constant desire to interact and build relations with the West. At what point did we realize that these so-called partners of ours were not really our partners? It was clear from the early 2000s. Yet we had illusions, I did too, which were about the following. Me and many others at that time believed that the problems in relations between the Soviet Union and the so-called West were primarily ideological differences. On one side, a communist regime, which was considered by many as tyranny, and on the other, the democratic world led by the United States. Strangely enough, I worked for almost 20 years in the Soviet Union's intelligence. I also thought that the main contradictions were of ideological nature. But the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no communist regime, yet the dismissive attitude towards the strategic interests of the Russian Federation remained not just dismissive, but it was all tied to the clear desire to achieve geopolitical advantages. Moreover, even when I became president, I didn't understand everything right away. I began to convey to my Western colleagues, look, you say one thing, but do another. Here is the proof. Then I presented this proof. They nodded and said, yes, yes, we will sort it out now. And nothing happened, it was quite the opposite. It became obvious to me that ideology might have had some significance, but essentially, all these contradictions are based on geopolitical interests. That was the main thing. I mean, the Soviet Union performed an auto da fe, it liquidated itself. Partly, I think, I never discussed this with my predecessors. They believed that Russia would become part of the so-called civilized world. In the West, they decided the following, there is no Soviet Union, so why should we follow the rules concerning Russia?